Cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. In this next segment, should get a lot of Texas fans, including myself, very hyped. We are going to continue with our fantasy college football player profiles with a guy who wants to make a statement in his final year at UT Austin, and that is, of course, the great Quinn Ewers. Let's talk about this young man for a bit, especially in terms of fantasy, where he could be a very sneaky pick to be your starting college football fantasy quarterback. And so, the thing I love about Quinn Ewers, right, is that consistency has always been the problem with him. But a lot of people don't necessarily talk about his mentality. It's a double-edged sword here. While he hasn't been as consistent as people have wanted him to be, his mentality has entirely changed. This is a new and improved Quinn Ewers we saw from when he arrived in the Texas campus, mullet and all, not necessarily fully committed to the project, and then to where he was last year, guiding Texas to the CFP, keeping them in games, just showing a great amount of moxie and development in himself that is going to translate to Texas starring in the SEC this year and having their expectations heightened so much. I think that Quinn Ewers is more than prepared to assume the mantle in his final season as one of the elite college football quarterbacks. And so without further ado, let's talk about his fantastic season last year and what he's going to take into his final year as the Texas Longhorns starting quarterback. Last year was his best season by far, 69% completion percentage, 3,479 yards, 22 touchdowns and 6 interceptions. A couple injuries, so who knows how much his stats could have been inflated if he started every game, but those stats certainly are very eye-popping compared to where he was as a freshman. His best performance in terms of fantasy was in that Big 12 championship game against Oklahoma State. 33.7 points, 35 for 46, 452 yards, 4 touchdowns, and 1 interception. That was the performance where a lot of people really took notice that if this Quinn Ewers showed up every day of the week, every Saturday, and played the way he did in that championship game, he would be in the reckoning for a Heisman and in the conversation as one of the elites in college football. His worst performance, though, was against Oklahoma. As we always know, the Red River rivalry brings out a lot in you, and unfortunately for Quinn Ewers, he hasn't really had a big game in the Red River rivalry to really separate him as one of the Texas elite. 12.4 points, 31 for 37, 346 yards. Are not terrible in terms of his passing numbers, but 1 TD and 2 interceptions doesn't do that to you. And so, when I look at Quinn Ewers for this year, it's certainly going to be a very exciting ride for the Texas Longhorns. They believe that they can compete with Georgia in the SEC. They believe that they can get one of those buys in the CFP. But at the end of the day, I really think what it's going to come down to is the new players in this setup. They lose Jonathan Brooks. They lose Xavier Worthy. They lose Jatavion Sanders in this offense. So they needed to replace all of those guys in a hurry. So what do? They go to the portal. They get Isaiah Bond, who has a lot of potential but hasn't really starred as a wide receiver one. Last year in Alabama, he had some big plays, but he never really, got to that level where he comfortably was a wide receiver one, but I think he's going to do very well in this Longhorn setup. They got Amari Nyblack at the tight end position, another guy who could potentially have a breakout season. And they got Matthew Golden and Silas Bolden from Houston and Oregon State, respectively. And those guys round out this receiver room that brings a lot of intrigue and hope and optimism to this Texas Longhorns offense. But that's all it really is, because we haven't seen them play together. And the comfortability and rapport that Quinn Ewers developed with guys like Worthy and Sanders might have disappeared a little bit. He's now going to have to break in new guys. And while it certainly isn't beyond him to do that, I certainly believe that his mentality is going to be key here. The consistency questions are always going to arise. If he has an off day, everyone's going to be talking about that. But his mentality is key. He completely changed his mindset last year, completely bought into the culture that Texas wanted. And as a result, he got to the CFP. Had one of the best seasons for Texas since that 05 season. And so I really believe that if he just ignores the consistency and focuses on mentality, that's where a lot of success will stem from. Because developing trust in receivers is not easy, especially when most of your receiving core from last year is gone. But I do believe his saving grace is that O-line, because unlike with the skill positions, the O-line retains most of its starters. Kelvin Banks could be a first-team All-American. I really think that this O-line is going to have its way with opposing SEC defenses and really help Quinn Ewers kind of settle down. That being said, I also think a large part of Quinn Ewers' success or failures in this coming season comes down to Steve Sarkisian. Because right now, I don't believe there's a coach in this country who places more trust in his depth than Steve Sarkisian. And what I mean by that is, I think that this season, it's a bold prediction for this season, I wouldn't be surprised if he puts Manning into some games. I wouldn't be surprised if he's more bold now that Texas is one of the deeper teams in the country. And so, for Quinn Ewers, especially for his fantasy prospects as well, it's all going to be about getting off to a fantastic start early on. And it's going to be difficult. They face Michigan in week 2, and I believe it's on the road. And Michigan has its own problems, but they're still going to be viewed as one of the elite teams in the country. If Texas wins that game, it truly cements them as someone to be reckoned with. And at the end of the day, that will truly help Quinn Ewers, no matter how they win every single week. Because last year with Texas, the gods of the close games were on their side. In the SEC, where it's very top-heavy, and you're going to get a lot of blowouts early on, it's going to be important for Texas in the big moments to really play within themselves. Because you can find consistency in the cupcake matches, but to play two big teams and still have the Red River rivalry in Michigan, Georgia, and Oklahoma, that's where you need to see vintage Quinn Ewers. Say he has a subpar game against a cupcake team on his schedule. That's all fine. If Texas wins, it's fine, because you don't place as much stock on those games as others. But if he underperforms in the Red River rivalry against Georgia, that's when all the doubt will seep in. And like I said, Sarkisian has trust in depth. He has trust in numbers. And he now understands that Texas are in a period of their history where good things can happen for them. History can get rewritten. This past couple of decades can be restored should Texas, in this revamped SEC, win a couple championships and ultimately, potentially, win it all in the college football playoff. And it all starts with this year. If Quinn Ewers rides off into the sunset a champion, he will go down in history no matter how ugly or exciting his season was. It's the Texas quarterback that brought them fully back. And that will set up, subsequently, what Arch Manning can do. Because there's also a lot of pressure on his shoulders. So if Quinn Ewers sets up everything nicely, if he's consistent every game, his mentality from last year carries over completely to this year. And he's like, I have new guys, but I think that they're going to work, and I'm going to trust in them to do their thing. That Quinn Ewers is going to be successful. That Quinn Ewers will restore pride and excitement and joy into the hearts of Texas fans. But if the Quinn Ewers that we see in some Red River rivalry games, the Quinn Ewers that we see in kind of games where Texas underestimates their opponents arises again, then who knows what will happen with this Texas program. If there's any sign of regression, people will immediately key into it, and that could damage this reputation of this team. And so, while Quinn Ewers should not assume so much pressure, it's definitely going to be on. In terms of fantasy, I believe there's no one better to really have a fun ride with in terms of fantasy college football, to ride onto the sunset with, than Quinn Ewers. And so, no matter how the season plays out for him, I think I'm going to trust him in his final season as a Texas Longhorn to do big things. But I'll just about do it for this segment. Coming next, we do some fun segments about some prop bets for different teams. We're going to start off kind of with some bad teams, but I promise as the weeks go on, more exciting teams to be talked about. But you'll see what I mean after the break on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.